They thought they knew what fear was. 4 months, the young soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend had lived with artillery, rockets, and the constant whine of Allied fighter bombers overhead. They had seen friends torn apart by shrapnel, tanks turned into burning coffins, villages flattened into dust. But what came at Falaise that day was different. It did not sound like courage or glory. It did not look like the iron storm their officers had promised they would conquer. It came like a ghost in the air, invisible, silent, and utterly without mercy. It came from the Canadians. The summer of 1944 in Normandy was supposed to be the season of triumph for Hitler's super soldiers. The 12th SS had been raised from fanatical Hitler youth, indoctrinated from childhood, told they were the vanguard of a new world. Their commanders had been on the Eastern Front. They had survived the Soviet winter, the burning fields of Kharkov, the mud and blood of countless retreats. They had watched entire Soviet divisions disappear under German fire and had come west convinced that no army on earth could match them. And yet, by August the writing was on the wall. The Allies had broken out of the hedgerows. American armored columns were racing through the French countryside, British and Canadian infantry were pushing south, and the once proud Wehrmacht was being squeezed from every side. Somewhere in those tightening jaws was the 12th SS, still convinced they could smash a hole in the Allied lines, still clinging to the idea that fanatical will could turn back steel and fire. But will means nothing when you cannot breathe. On the Canadian side the mood was very different. Many of the men facing the 12th SS were not regular soldiers in the grand old European sense. They were farmers' sons from Saskatchewan, loggers from British Columbia, dockworkers from Halifax. They had grown up in small towns and big cities thousands of miles away, under wide northern skies, believing in ice hockey, freedom, and a country that, until a few years ago, had seemed too young and too far to be dragged into Europe's madness. They had come to Normandy with a particular kind of anger. They had seen the photographs and film of what the Nazis had done. They had heard of the massacres, the burned villages, the dead children scattered in ditches across Eastern Europe. They had landed at Juno Beach under machine gun fire and mortar blasts, watching their friends collapse into the surf. They had seen what the 12th SS did to Canadian prisoners in the days after D-Day. Men marched away with their hands behind their heads, only to be found later in shallow graves, shot in the back of the neck. For many Canadians this had stopped being just a war. It was a reckoning. By mid-August 1944, the battle around the Falaise Pocket had become something almost beyond imagination. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped in a shrinking cauldron of fire. American forces were pressing from the south. British and Polish forces were closing from the north. And in the middle, along roads choked with refugees, tanks, artillery and wounded men, the 12th SS was trying to escape annihilation. The Canadians had been given a simple order: close the gap. Do not let them out. Canadian artillery officers looked at their maps, at the converging lines of German retreat, and knew that the moment was coming. They could see where the roads pinched together, where columns of German vehicles would have to pass, where fear and desperation would force them into narrow lanes of death. They had guns. They had rockets. They had air support. But they also had something else. In quiet briefings, far from the front lines, certain Canadian officers had been told about a special kind of shell. It was not talked about openly, not written about in newspapers. It did not explode like a conventional high-explosive round. It did not simply send shards of metal tearing through flesh. It did something colder. It turned the very air into a weapon. The men in those briefings had looked at the diagrams, how the shell burst above ground, how it released a dense cloud that hugged the earth, how it rolled along low ground and seeped into trenches, dugouts, and open vehicle hatches. It did not need to be seen to kill. It only needed to be breathed. Somewhere near Falaise, in a makeshift gun position scraped out of French soil, Canadian artillerymen read target coordinates. They checked their elevation, adjusted their fuses, and loaded shells that looked, on the outside, just like any other. Heavy, anonymous, cold. The kind of anonymity that made it easier not to think too hard. They had lost friends to the 12th SS. They had seen the bullet-riddled bodies of Canadian prisoners. Some had looked down at corpses in Canadian uniforms and found faces they recognized. Boys they had trained with, joked with, eaten with. Now those faces were half buried in mud, their eyes still open. It does something to a man. As the guns were prepared, one of the Canadian gunners, a young man named Robert, stood with a shell cradled in his gloved hands. His cheeks were smeared with dirt and sweat. He had not slept properly in days. The pounding of the guns had become a second heartbeat in his skull. He thought of his younger brother back home, still in high school, still playing hockey on frozen ponds. He thought of the letter from his mother, folded and refolded until the edges had worn soft. He remembered her words, pleading with him to stay safe, come home. He was about to fire a weapon that would make staying safe for the enemy almost impossible. The order came down the line. The 12th SS had been spotted. A long line of their vehicles was moving along a narrow road near the village, trying to slip away through the gap before it slammed shut. Tanks, trucks, half-tracks, horse-drawn wagons, even small groups of walking wounded, all trying to escape the tightening circle. They were in range. In the cramped steel belly of a German half-track, a 19-year-old machine gunner named Karl huddled with his comrades. Sweat darkened his uniform, and a crust of dust clung to his hair and eyelashes. He had not washed properly in weeks. His hands shook, not from cold, but from pure exhaustion and the knowledge that somewhere behind them the Allies were closing in. The smell inside the vehicle was a sour mix of fuel, sweat, and fear. He had joined the Hitler Youth as a boy because everyone did. The uniform, the marches, the songs, they made him feel like part of something greater. When officers had come recruiting for the 12th SS Panzer Division, they had stood before the boys like gods from another world, medals gleaming, uniforms immaculate. They had told him that the division would be unstoppable, that they would defend Europe from Bolshevik hordes and degenerate democracies. Karl had believed them. He had believed them when they said the Western Allies were soft, that they had no stomach for real war, that they would break at the sight of blood. He did not believe that anymore. He had seen Canadian infantry crawling forward through bursts of machine gun fire, refusing to fall back. He had seen Canadian tanks inch past burning wrecks, over bodies, straight into the teeth of German guns. He had seen pilots in cockpits so low overhead that he swore he had seen their eyes, cold and focused even as flak burst around them. Whatever the Allies were, they were not soft. The 12th SS had earned a reputation for cruelty, firing until the barrels of their MG-42s glowed red, shooting civilians, executing POWs. They had thought that terror would break their enemies. Instead, it had hardened them. Now, as the half-track jolted and lurched along the overcrowded French road, Karl coughed into his sleeve. The dust from the dried-out ground rose in clouds, sucked into the vehicle and turning into thick, chalky air. The convoy in front of them slowed. Somewhere ahead, a vehicle had broken down or taken a hit. They were bunching up. In the distance, beyond the hedgerows and the haze, the first Canadian shells began to fall. The thunder rolled over the landscape like the growl of some colossal beast. High-explosive shells screamed in and detonated along the road, tossing earth, metal, and flesh into the air. Columns of smoke rose, black and oily, streaked with orange flames. Horses reared and screamed before collapsing. Men shouted, some in command, some in panic. But then another kind of shell detonated. It did not roar. It sighed. Above the road, at carefully calculated heights, they burst, not with the sharp, tearing crack of normal artillery, but with a damp, heavy thump. For a split second, nothing seemed to happen. And then the air changed. Karl noticed it before he understood it. The dust in the vehicle seemed thicker, the light dimmer. A faint, sharp scent crept into his nostrils, something chemical, unfamiliar, like cleaning fluid turned malignant. He coughed again, harder this time. His eyes began to sting. Was this Das? One of his comrades muttered, pressing a cloth to his face. Outside, along the road and in the ditches, a low, crawling mist began to drift. It was not natural fog. It moved with purpose, clinging to the earth, slipping into hollows and folds where frightened men had thrown themselves for cover. It poured over the lips of foxholes. It slid under vehicle tarps and into open hatches. A pale, ghost-like cloud, invisible in places, visible in others only as a shimmer where the air should have been clear. Some of the older German veterans, men who had served in the last war or who had listened at the elbows of fathers who had felt their blood run cold. They had heard the stories. They knew what gas was. On the Canadian side of the lines, the artillery crews did not see the details, but they saw enough. Through binoculars, forward observers watched the German column begin to writhe. Men stumbled from vehicles, clutching at their faces, tearing off helmets, scraping at their throats as if they could unzip their skin and climb out of it. Some dropped to their knees. Some ran blindly, crashing into ditches, into each other, into burning wrecks. One observer, a young lieutenant with a calm voice and haunted eyes, described it later in a letter he never sent. It was as if something had reached down and taken the air away from them. Robert and his gun crew heard only fragments over the radio. Target effect observed. Increased agitation, enemy movement erratic. Sterile warnings, clinical judgments wrapped around human catastrophe. The men at the guns could guess though. They had been told enough to fill in the missing picture. Robert closed his eyes for a moment between salvos. In the darkness behind his eyelids he did not see German soldiers. He saw the faces of the Canadians he had lost. He saw the bodies in the ditch, the bullet holes, the blood-stained grass around their heads. The officer's voice cracked across the battery again. Fire. He opened his eyes, shouldered the weight of the next shell and stepped forward. Inside the half-track the world had become a nightmare. The air seared Karl's lungs. His first instinct was to suck in a deep breath, to cough out whatever was burning him inside. But the more he inhaled, the worse it became. His throat felt as if someone had poured liquid fire down it. His chest refused to expand. Panic turned his fingers into claws, digging into the metal walls of the vehicle as if he could tear them down and find clean air on the other side. His friend beside him gagged, claws at his neck, eyes bulging, veins standing out on his forehead. Another man rammed his helmet against the rear door, trying to force it open, but his hands slipped. He collapsed halfway upright, his body twitching. Outside men were screaming. Some of the German officers shouted orders. Masks. Put on your masks. But most of the men did not have them. This was not 1915. They had expected shells, bullets, tanks. Not this. The whispers that the Allies would never use such things had turned into one more shattered illusion on a day full of them. Those who did find gas masks fumbled with the straps, their fingers clumsy with terror. Some got them on in time. Others sealed them crookedly, letting death slip in around the edges. Karl could not find his. His pack was somewhere under the legs of 3 other men, one of whom was already sprawled unmoving across the floor, his tongue lolling out, eyes glassy and unfocused. Every breath Karl took felt heavier, like inhaling broken glass. He dropped to his knees, then to his hands. The deck of the half-track was sticky and slick. His vision blurred. In that narrowing tunnel of sight, he saw things in flashes. A photograph tucked into one man's tunic, a silver cross at another's neck, a small carved wooden toy jammed into the corner of a seat, a reminder of a child far away. The war had stripped these boys down to uniforms and numbers. But in that moment, as they choked on the invisible hand squeezing their lungs, all their separate lives rushed back into them with terrible clarity. One had wanted to be a teacher. One had left behind a fiancée he would never see again. One had never even been kissed. The cloud did not care. It did not know ideology, promises, or prayers. It did not distinguish between the fanatical and the reluctant, between those who had shot prisoners and those who had looked away. It only knew flesh. Back at the Canadian positions, the guns continued their relentless cycle. Load, ram, fire, recoil, smoke, load again. The men's muscles burned. Their ears rang. Some licked cracked lips and tasted cordite and dust. They worked because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant picturing exactly what their shells were doing out there. Some of them needed that picture. Some of them feared it. For every Canadian whose rage burned hot at the memory of murdered comrades, there was another who lay awake at night, staring up into the darkness of his shelter, seeing the faces of the men he had killed without ever laying eyes on them. War had pushed them into a place where the only moral choice left most days was between killing and being killed. But this felt different. The whispered word chemical had a weight to it, a history. Their grandfathers had told stories of the First World War, of yellow clouds rolling across no man's land, of men clawing at their faces and throats as gas ate their lungs from the inside. Those stories had been warnings, nightmares from a previous generation, proof of how far humanity could fall. And now here they were, at Falaise, standing on the edge of that same abyss. The order to fire had come with all the authority of command, of strategy, of necessity. Close the pocket. Break the enemy's will. Destroy their ability to fight. It made sense on paper. It even made sense in the cold logic of survival. But logic does not always soothe the conscience. So the Canadians kept their thoughts mostly to themselves. They concentrated on the mechanics. Angle, shell, fuse, charge. They focused on each other, on shouted jokes between salvos, on the gruff encouragement of sergeants, on the rituals of battle that made the horror slightly easier to bear. Somewhere between salvos, Robert glanced at the horizon. The sky above Falaise was smudged and ugly. Smoke from burning vehicles and bombed-out villages smeared the blue into a sickly gray. Here and there, rising from the trapped German columns, were plumes of darker smoke shot through with angry orange. He wondered, not for the first time, what it smelled like over there. In the German lines the cloud kept moving. It flowed into low spots in the terrain, pooling the way water pools, sinking into the very places soldiers had once thought were safe. Men who had thrown themselves into ditches to escape shrapnel now found themselves inhaling something far worse. Foxholes that had sheltered them from machine gun fire became traps where they would drown not in mud, but in their own collapsing lungs. Some tried to run upslope, away from the thicker air. They scrambled out of ditches and tripped over bodies, their own muscles betraying them as oxygen failed to reach their blood. They gasped, mouths open, lips flecked with foam. A few made it several dozen meters before their knees buckled. A field medic, his own lungs burning, tried to tend to a teenager whose face was turning a frightening shade of blue. The boy clawed at his arm, eyes wide and pleading without words. The medic knew there was nothing in his field kit that could fix what was happening inside those lungs. He tried anyway. Because sometimes the only thing that keeps a man human in such a place is the refusal, however futile, to stop trying. Above all this, high in the sky, a Canadian pilot in a fighter bomber banked his plane and peered down through the haze. From his altitude, the suffering was almost abstract. He saw convoys smeared across the countryside, explosions blooming like cruel flowers, lines of smoke twisting into the sky. He radioed back, columns hit. Heavy losses. They're in chaos down there. He could not see the detail. He could not see the cloud pressing into the lungs of boys barely younger than himself. By late afternoon, the road had become a grave. Vehicles stood at odd angles, some with their tracks blown off, some burned down to charred skeletons. Bodies lay in the ditches, on the shoulders, tangled in barbed wire, half covered by dust and debris. Some had died with their hands at their throats. Others lay on their backs, mouths open in silent screams. The phrase that would echo later in hushed post-war conversations, "half the Wehrmacht vaporized," was not literally true in the physical sense. Bodies did not vanish into thin air like phantoms. They remained, solid and heavy, testament to the cost of that single day. But in terms of fighting strength, of organized resistance, of the will and capacity of the 12th SS to act as a coherent force, the phrase was not so far from the truth. Whole companies ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Junior officers, once so sure of their invincibility, staggered through the wreckage trying to gather the remnants of their units, only to find blank faces, burned-out stairs, or no one at all. Radios crackled with broken messages, half-screamed coordinates, desperate pleas for air support or artillery that would never come. For the 12th SS, Falaise did not feel like a battle. It felt like the end of the world. As dusk crept over the battlefield, the smoke and haze thickened. The air cooled, but the smell became worse: burned flesh, fuel, shattered earth, and something else sharper that clung to the back of the throat. Flies appeared, drawn to the sudden feast the day had laid out. Canadian infantrymen moved forward, cautiously, through what their guns and shells had created. They stepped past wrecked tanks emblazoned with black crosses, their turrets blown sideways. They walked beside ditches where still forms lay twisted. Some of the dead looked oddly peaceful, as if they had simply fallen asleep. Others did not. The Canadians had learned not to stare too long. You did not want to recognize yourself in those faces. More than one man glanced down at a corpse in a German uniform and saw not an enemy, but simply a boy whose life had run parallel to his own, on a different road, under a different flag. One Canadian private, pushing through the thick, metallic-tasting air, paused by the body of a German soldier curled on his side, hands still clutching at his chest. The private had a pencil tucked behind one ear, a habit from his pre-war life as a clerk. He had always wanted to write. He knelt for a moment, staring at the dead young man's face. He could have been anyone. A neighbor. A classmate. A rival on some forgotten hockey rink. Instead, he was another casualty in a war that had swallowed individuality and spat out numbers. The private whispered something under his breath. Perhaps an apology. Perhaps nothing at all. Then he stood up and moved on. Behind the lines, far from the immediate horror, word of the day's outcome filtered upward. Maps were updated. Arrows shifted. The report spoke of heavy enemy losses and successful interdiction of retreat routes. Commanders nodded, satisfied. The Falaise Pocket was closing. The German army in Normandy was being destroyed, its spine snapped, its future operations crippled. From a purely military perspective, it was what needed to happen. The 12th SS, once so feared, would never be the same. Its veterans would carry the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. The choking, the burning, the panic, the realization that no amount of training or fanaticism could stop a force that attacked the very act of breathing. Some would try to bury it. Others would relive it in nightmares. On the Canadian side, the medals and citations that would be awarded for actions taken in those crucial days around Falaise would mostly mention bravery under fire, leadership, initiative, and sacrifice. They would rarely mention the other word, the one that hung like a shadow over the battlefield: chemical. After the war, treaties and agreements would reaffirm the world's revulsion toward such weapons. Official histories would glide past certain details, smoothing over the edges of what had been done in the name of necessity, victory, and survival. But the land remembers. For years, farmers around Falaise would plow their fields and turn up rusted shell fragments. Children would play on the edges of old, overgrown craters, unaware of what had once filled the air above those hollows. Visitors would stand on quiet country roads, reading plaques and monuments that spoke of encirclements and offensives and valor, without smelling the ghost of that sickly sweet scent that had once ridden the wind. War is often told in numbers. So many divisions encircled. So many tanks destroyed. So many casualties estimated, rounded to the nearest thousand, made almost abstract by the scale. But behind every number is a moment like the one in that half-track, where a boy named Carl realized in a single, searing instant that he might never breathe freely again. Behind every statistic is a Canadian gunner like Robert, hands blistered and ears ringing, wondering in the quiet moments between salvos what kind of man he would be when this was over, if he lived to find out. Sometimes, the most terrifying weapons in war are not the ones that make the biggest noise. Sometimes, they are the ones that show us how thin the line really is between civilization and barbarism, between rules and desperation, between what we say we will never do and what we do when our backs are against the wall. At Falaise in those days of August 1944, that line blurred. The Canadians had come to Normandy as liberators, fighting against a regime that had industrialized mass murder, that had gassed its victims in chambers disguised as showers. They were on the right side of history, pushing back against something genuinely evil. But in the dirt and smoke and panic of the battlefield, the tools they used could not always tell the difference between justified cause and monstrous method. A shell does not know why it is fired. A cloud does not care what flag you wear. In the end, the story of what that Canadian weapon did to the 12th SS at Falaise is not just a tale of tactical success, or of an elite Nazi division brought low by the men they once mocked as colonials. It is a story about how far war can push ordinary people, about the terrible things they can be made to do, and about the haunted silence that often follows the cheers of victory. Because when the guns fall silent and the smoke drifts away, what remains are not just wrecked vehicles and scattered bones. What remains are questions. How much is too much even in a just war? Where is the line between necessary force and unforgivable cruelty? And when we cross that line, quietly, without fanfare, one desperate decision at a time, do we ever really find our way back? For the survivors of the 12th SS who stumbled out of that cauldron, coughing and half-blind, the war would go on, but something in them had shattered. The invincible shield of ideology had cracked, and through those cracks seeped the knowledge that even the master race, even the elite, could be brought to its knees by a weapon they could not see. For the Canadians who marched past the twisted wreckage, boots crunching on broken glass and shell fragments, the war would also go on. They would fight through Belgium, the Netherlands, into Germany itself. They would liberate towns, free prisoners, be welcomed with flowers and tears. But some part of them would always remember Falaise. The day the air itself turned against their enemy. The day half a division seemed to vanish in the space of a heartbeat. The day they learned that victory, even when it feels righteous, can carry a taste that lingers long after the banners are folded and the medals are boxed and put away in drawers. In the years to come, many of them would not talk about it. Some would drink instead. Some would work, raise families, mow lawns, and sit silently at the edge of their sons' hockey rinks, staring at the ice and hearing, in the hiss of skates, the distant echo of shells. And somewhere, on a quiet road near Falaise, the wind would still move through the hedgerows, carrying only the scents of grass and earth and distant wood smoke. No trace of the cloud. No hint of the day when the sky itself became a weapon. Only the land remembers. And the men who were there.